Our ancestors' diets were rich in the essential vitamins, minerals, and phytonutrients needed for optimal function. But today, thanks to declining soil quality, a growing toxic burden, and other challenges in the modern world, most of us are not getting enough of these critical nutrients. That's why I created Adapt Naturals. It's a supplement line that closes the modern nutrient gap so you can feel and perform your best. Unlike most supplements that contain cheap synthetic compounds your body can't absorb, we use clinician grade, bioavailable ingredients that make a real and noticeable difference. I've translated 15 years of experience treating hundreds of patients and training over 3,000 healthcare providers into a supplement line you can trust. No BS or hype, just high quality, research backed, clinically validated products that get results. Our supplements are made without gluten or GMOs. They're also third party tested to validate ingredients and confirm they're free of heavy metals and other toxins. We have a full range of products, from the most advanced multivitamin and phytonutrient formula on the market to a blend of 8 organic superfood mushrooms, including reishi, chaga, and cordyceps, to a one-of-a-kind fish oil with bioavailable forms of curcumin and black seed oil. Our newest product is Luminous Mind, a blend of 7 nootropic compounds that boost cognitive function and elevate mood, including citicoline, UMP, bacopa, ginkgo, and lion's mane mushroom. These nootropic ingredients improve focus, memory, and attention, boost motivation and mood, and promote emotional and psychological resilience. They do this without the jitteriness, agitation, and sleep disturbances that often accompany caffeine. They also support brain health by protecting neurons, promoting neuroplasticity, and even regenerating new brain cells. Luminous Mind's a perfect fit for students, knowledge workers, entrepreneurs, creators, artists, people under mental or emotional stress, and those struggling with cognitive issues, low mood, and difficulty focusing and concentrating. I think of it as an unfair advantage that can help you achieve your goals, whatever they may be. Head to adaptnaturals.com to learn more and start living the life you want to live. Hey everyone, Chris Kresser here. Welcome to another episode of Revolution Health Radio. This week I'm excited to welcome Dr. Kien Vuu as my guest. He's also known as Dr. V, and he has become a passionate advocate for health, happiness, and human potential. He has a fascinating story. He was a refugee from Vietnam. In his childhood, he emigrated to the United States, and he became a medical doctor and very quickly worked his way up to the top of his field in interventional radiology. He became the chief of his hospital, won lots of accolades, and was traveling around the world speaking at conferences, and eventually determined that he was very unhappy doing that. He was overweight, he was diabetic, he was starting to develop several different chronic diseases, and despite being renowned in his field and accomplishing everything that he set out to accomplish, he didn't have the life that he wanted to have. So he began an exploration of spirituality and health and human performance, and has now, over the past several years, merged science and spirituality in his work. He's the founder of Vuu Performance and Longevity. He's the author of Thrive State, a really incredible book. He consults with high performers, athletes, leaders, Fortune 500 companies seeking to improve their health, performance, engagement, and prosperity. And what I love about his work is that it really transcends conventional boundaries of medicine, extending into psychology, philosophy, personal development, and spirituality, as I mentioned. So I really enjoyed this conversation with Dr. V. I think you will as well. Let's dive in. Dr. V, pleasure to have you on the show. Thanks for joining me.
Chris, I've actually been a fan for a while. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. So you are a huge advocate for health, happiness, and human potential. That's maybe not necessarily the default career path for an MD. Of course, there are many who are exploring those avenues, but it's not really the conventional direction to go. So how did you end up in the place that you are now? I know you have a really interesting story, your childhood and the background you come from. I'd just love to hear a little bit more about how you arrived here today.
Well, great question. Many people hear me on the phone and they think, "Oh my gosh, when I first meet you, I did not expect you to look a certain way. I was actually born in Vietnam shortly after the fall of Vietnam, and I actually escaped on a refugee boat filled with 2,000 other refugees. We were on a boat for 8 months in a Philippine refugee camp for another 3 months, and then we were sponsored to America by a Catholic church. And growing up, I remember being teased a lot. I got bused to a more affluent area for school. I was teased for the holes in my hand-me-down clothes, for the stinky food my mom sent me to school with. I got a lot of comments like, "Go back to your home country, Chinky."
Yeah.
And I remember back in the day, my revenge would be to be rich and famous. And I remember being inspired by people like Robin Williams, Tony Robbins, and Mick Jagger. But when I looked at people that looked like me in the media, they were caricatures. I don't know if you remember Andy Rooney in The Breakfast Club, but he played this caricature of an Asian person, and that's how I felt the world looked at me. And so growing up, I always thought that being myself and being able to express who I was as a person was never really enough. That I had to put on some kind of mask. I had to change the way I sounded. I needed to sound more American. I needed to adopt a personality. You know, I wanted to do media and entertainment. I felt like I had a voice that wanted to share that. But my mom, who loved to remind me that they didn't travel across the world on a refugee boat for me to become a comedian. And so she said, "You have three choices. You could be a doctor, a physician, or an MD." And so, I I went to medical school. But the drive of not feeling enough and not feeling worthy just constantly led me to chase down something outside of myself for me to feel good, which was to get to be valedictorian at my high school, to be able to get into the top colleges, medical schools. And when I was in medical schools, how do I find the toughest residencies to go to in a field of medicine that was cutting edge? So I ended up being an interventional radiologist. So that's a doctor that uses medical imaging or radiology to perform minimally invasive surgeries. And after I graduated, became an attending, I climbed the ranks, was traveling around the world to speak about the innovations of interventional radiology. I become chief of interventional radiology at my hospital. Then about 8 years ago, overweight, diabetic, high blood pressure, prescription medications. This is somebody that was trained at the National Institutes of Health, the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, UCLA, all alike, being able to get disease. And it was really one of those wake up calls that said, you know what, I'm not given the information to really be healthy. And it was at that point that I started to pursue, additional sciences, anti-aging, regenerative longevity medicine, which was very lifestyle focused. And then I tapped a little bit into spirituality. In a very short period of time, I actually reversed conditions that were considered very chronic and lifetime conditions for people. And so it was really my journey of self-healing that allowed me to step into, this longevity space. And what I really do now, not only love talking about the latest advances in longevity medicine, but to recognize one thing that I find most important, that how we live our life, how we approach every single moment of our life, the energy and the consciousness we bring to each moment to our life is actually medicine.
Mm. Yeah, I love that, and I would agree with that wholeheartedly. And it sounds like that was a major shift for you in recognizing that there was a disconnect between how you were approaching your life on a day and experiencing yourself on a day-to-day basis, even though you'd achieved the highest echelons of performance in your field and recognition and accolades. You were not, I presume, given what you just said, you were not experiencing joy and fulfillment and health and well-being in the way that you thought you might once you got to the top
Yeah,
of your field in that respect.
yeah.
And this is not, you're not alone in that, right? I mean, we see, I'm sure you saw many of your colleagues in a similar situation, whether they were aware of it or not, or eventually, went in a different direction. That this is actually a familiar story, all too familiar story, isn't it?
It's a very, very familiar story. Certainly, I have colleagues right now. I've lost actually some colleagues to cancer and heart disease very early on who were just stressed out working at the hospital. I mean, in medical training, we certainly have produced a culture of people not listening to their own body's needs and constantly caring for others, but caring in a way that one wasn't very useful. We never really learned any behavioral type of things that made people choose the disease that they actually had. So we never really got training in doing so, and just the residency training all the way up until us practicing was really saying no to ourselves, saying no to our bodies and our intuition, and driving the narrative of these type A personalities that probably felt like they were not enough or worthy at some point in life. And we're starting to be able to understand this concept a little bit more because neuroscientists are beginning to learn more about a part of the brain called the default mode network. This is a very primitive part of our brain and nervous system. And as we're developing in utero all the way up until the age of 10, it just is a system that's going to help us keep us safe and help us survive. It's the brain autopilot system. And so at a very early age, it's going to download beliefs, values, mindsets, worldviews from our parents, from our teachers, from society, from TV, from media, all these things around us. It's intimately tied to our amygdala or fear centers and our hippocampus or our memory centers. And because this thing is supposed to keep us alive, it's going to remember the things that emotionally charge us and make us fear the most. And as human beings, we need safety, love, and connection. And when we don't feel like we've gotten those things as a child, we would start to adapt certain type of behaviors to get them. And unless we are aware of this, most of these things are programmed before the age of 10. They become the seats of our ego. For me, that programming was you're not enough or I'm not enough. I'm not worthy. And so something outside of me, I need to seek success. I need to behave in a certain way. I need to strive. And you become someone you're not. You develop this inauthentic way of being and running life through that mode, or not being conscious that you're running your life through that mode actually drives the stress response in our body that basically gives the signal to every single one of our cells that you're running away from a saber-toothed tiger. So inflammation goes up, our immune system drops down. Those two things epigenetically, we're giving ourselves the signals of danger. And then our cells are basically driving energy towards increasing inflammation, just in case we got a flesh wound, and dropping down our immune system. Because why expend that energy on fighting against cancer or infection when you're about to be someone's lunch?
Absolutely. And
And so
yeah, go ahead.
people, yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I think social media and screens have amplified this tremendously. I actually just started reading a new book by Jonathan Haidt called The Anxious Generation: How the Great Rewiring of Childhood is Causing an Epidemic of Mental Illness. And, I've written and spoken about this a lot over the years and interviewed a ton of people on this topic over the years. But what we know is that constant interaction with the screen, constant notifications just keep us in that default mode network state. And then especially apps like Instagram. Like I have a 12-year-old daughter. She's not allowed to have an Instagram account. We have, pretty significant limits on her screen use. But I see this with a lot of her friends. It especially for teenagers who are just hardwired to seek approval, and especially for teenage or adolescent
Yes.
girls, the Instagram and apps like that just constantly do what you're talking about. They create a source of extrinsic motivation where we're always monitoring our own experience and thinking about how we're going to talk about, post about it on Instagram, and then what the response to that will be, rather than tuning into our own intrinsic motivations and desires, which is to say, our own experience, which, I know, we'll talk about this, like spirituality and meditation and mindfulness actually help us become aware of what our own internal experience is. But it seems to me that almost everything in our culture, the way things are heading now, is designed to take us out of our own experience and create these external reference points that we use to measure our self-worth and even just kind of be the compass for our day-to-day life.
No, I completely agree. And a bigger question is, is there a consciousness that's driving all that?
Hmm.
Are there pockets and dollars that are driving our ability to leave ourselves and our own intuition to tap into something that, can be easily controlled?
The $1 trillion rhetorical question. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I've
Right?
had, I mean, I'm sure you're familiar with the social dilemma and Tristan Harris's work, but
Yeah.
that's the essence of it is we're not the customers, we're the product. And these multinational corporations are maximizing our attention so they can sell it to the highest bidder. And that's the business model of social media. And that's what I often remind people of. It's not a fair fight. It's not like we're just sort of one individual dealing with our own, addictive tendencies or like our own propensity to get hooked into something. It's not an individual thing. I mean, of course, there are individual patterns and ultimately we have choice in how we respond to it, but we have to understand that there is I that is highly profit motivated to overcome whatever conscious resistance we might be able to marshal in this fight, and most people are just going to lose. Like that's not a condemnation or a judgment. It means that they are so sophisticated in how they hijack our basic biochemistry and our hard the things that actually enabled us to survive in our ancestral environment are being hijacked in such a way that they work against us now. And that's, I think, the thing that people need to understand to release the blame and the guilt and the shame that might come with, like, oh, I'm failing to work with this or to overcome this personally. Well, yeah, because it's designed for you to fail, basically.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
You really, in your own life and in your work, you talk a lot about fusing science and spirituality as being the future of biohacking and health. And we can break down biohacking and what that means to you, because that's a term that means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So let's start there. This 30,000 foot view. Why do you think that's so important in this day and age to merge science and spirituality? If anything, to me, it seems like in the recent few years, they're moving apart rather than together, which is unfortunate because I think that I agree with you that they actually need to be merged. So talk a little bit about that, and then we'll talk about how biohacking fits under that umbrella for you.
Yeah, thanks. When I look at the field of longevity, I'm very excited because there are a lot of scientific advances that allow us to pierce into the human biology so much more. Certainly, we have diagnostics like, new type of CT scans that look at soft plaque and our ability to predict heart attacks have never been better. We certainly have new DNA based type of technology that catches, cancer even really before they manifest, full body MRIs. We've got stem cells and exosomes, regenerative products that allow our body to heal itself a little bit better. So there's so much that's out there, and I put that in the bucket of the science of longevity, and just seeing what's about to come out there. All these technologies are going to exponentially increase with AI, and they're really, really exciting. The things that they've seen in rodent models and in the petri dish, and hopefully translating into humans very soon. So the science of longevity is brilliant. However, if we look around the world to where people have lived the longest. And it's not great science over there, but there's a book certainly that I'm pretty sure your audience knows about called The Blue Zones. These places that Dan Buettner and his team discovered were the largest concentration of centenarians, people living over 100. And they did some broad-based studies, some observational studies as to why they live so long. And they came up with these 9 different things. And a lot of these things were just very simple. They moved naturally every day. They didn't stuff themselves with food. They all had a deep sense of a family, a tribe that they belonged to. And they had this thing called eudaimonic happiness, which is not hedonic happiness, which is the pleasure of getting something, achieving something, money, things like that. But eudaimonic happiness is the happiness you feel when you feel like you're connected to something bigger. It's the happiness that's associated by having purpose. So I took these observational type studies and asked, are there any molecular or epigenetic data that living this way could actually lead to a longer life? And as I discovered this, particularly with my colleague over at UCLA, Stephen Cole, we looked at sleep, nutrition, movement, sense of purpose, community, our emotional states, where our thoughts are, and we actually started to see epigenetic changes in certain gene complexes, as well as the work from Elizabeth Epple and blanking on her name, uh, Elizabeth Blackburn on telomeres. That how we live our life, our approach to life, actually changes how our DNA is being expressed. And the more I started to do this, I started to understand that it was a state of being that the people in the blue zones had, that they started to actually change the biochemistry of their body, ultimately leading to changes in genetic expression. So what I learned from them most is, yes, we've got the science of longevity, but how you live your life is also medicine. That there's also the art of living. How are you approaching each moment? By what consciousness are you approaching each moment? Are you in that consciousness that's gotten hijacked and always looking for fear? Like, I got to hustle to get the next dollar. This person just run me off, on the freeway, and building these emotions of stress and anger in your body, which we know biochemically what happens, actually what happens on the genetic level now we know as well. So that is a very important piece. I love what's happening around in the science. However, I also know of certain populations of people that I've worked with. They constantly want the newest and greatest thing that's out there, and they want the latest protocols, and they're stressed out about following the protocols to the T, that I'm like, you're not doing it right, my friend.
Yeah.
It's how you approach your life. And so it's melding those two things together, which I think is going to compound our ability to not only live longer, but to be the very best version of ourselves and age better as well.
Yeah, I have a very similar take. I mean, being in clinical practice as a functional medicine clinician for many years, you can imagine I had plenty of patients who show up with, spreadsheets that would go on and on and on with every biomarker you can possibly imagine, and trend lines and analysis and all kinds of stuff.
Hmm.
And then I would start talking to them about just basic stuff like, do you have good relationships in your life? Are you doing anything for fun? What are your hobbies? And it turns out that their hobby was essentially managing the spreadsheet with all of their health data and, trying to tweak every last variable and make it perfect. And I rarely encountered somebody like that who was truly happy and who
Yeah.
really seemed to have a love, just an innate sense of joy, eudaimonia, whatever you want
Yeah.
to call it. Because as you said, like you're confusing the forest for the trees, and you're getting further and further away, often in that kind of obsessive mentality from
Yeah.
the things that make life worth living. And often it was better for those people to actually take a step back. I spent a lot of time trying to encourage them to take a step back from that approach to biohacking, because it wasn't, my simple question to them was usually, has this made your life better? Like,
Yeah.
has this actually subjectively made your experience of yourself on a day-to-day basis better? And the answer was very often no. So
Yeah.
I'm in full agreement with you there, and I think it's really an important piece, especially in this age of AI and quantified self, where it's becoming easier and easier to take that type of approach, where because
Yeah.
you can process the data more efficiently and even have LLMs build spreadsheets for you and sort of outsource some of that material. So going back to the default mode network and the mental autopilot, which is an
Yeah.
easy way of thinking about it, we have this mental autopilot that's often running in the background, and that, as we've discussed, social media and screens and other factors in the modern world just kind of amplify that and keep it going. But then we have the CTRA, the Conserved Transcriptional Response to Adversity. And this is a system, as you've talked about, where when we perceive stress, it's like a genetic alarm system that gets
Yep.
triggered. And that, in an ancestral environment, that might have happened in an acute setting where,
Yep.
like, oh, there's a lion,
Yep.
and then it happens, whatever happens, and then it's over. And then we're back to a more parasympathetic nervous
Yes.
system response, right? But the problem in our society is that many of us are just living in this CTRA chronic activation. And
Yeah.
what is the problem with that? I mean, at the risk of stating the obvious, like, I think it's
Right.
worth talking a little bit about what the research shows
Hmm.
when we live in a state of chronic CTRA activation. I'm so excited to announce the latest product I formulated for my supplement line, Adapt Naturals. Luminous Mind is a blend of 7 nootropic compounds that boost cognitive function and elevate mood, including phosphatidylserine, bacopa, ginkgo, lion's mane, and more. Nootropics are substances that improve focus, memory, and attention, boost motivation and mood, and promote emotional and psychological resilience. They also support brain health by protecting neurons, promoting neuroplasticity, and even regenerating new brain cells. I spent over 2 years researching, developing, and testing this product. One of our early testers described the experience of taking it as turning the lights back on. She felt clear-headed, focused, and alert, yet calm and grounded without the jitteriness or crashes of caffeine. She also said her mood was brighter and she felt uplifted and enlivened. This was the inspiration for calling it Luminous Mind. I designed this supplement for anyone who wants to boost their cognitive function, creativity, and mood, and support and protect their brain health. It's a perfect fit for students, knowledge workers, entrepreneurs, creators, artists, people under mental or emotional stress, and those struggling with cognitive issues, low mood, and difficulty focusing and concentrating. Think of it as an unfair advantage that can help you achieve your goals, whatever they may be. Visit adaptnaturals.com to learn more about Luminous Mind and place your first order.
Let's break down CTRA again. It's called the Conserved Transcriptional Response to Adversity. So a lot of times our DNA is built in where if it signals certain type of things in the environment, these gene complexes that will turn on to create, changes in our cells, the behavior of our cells. So the CTRA is made up of, I don't know, 150 or so genes. And within those genes, you have a set of genes that actually code for inflammation and inflammatory markers. And then you also have some antiviral and immunity type of genes that are within this complex. What happens when the body perceives stress? Again, when there's a saber-toothed tiger or a neighboring village about to attack us, it's going to rev our body and skew its energy resources for danger. So it's going to turn on, upregulate all those inflammatory genes, because what if you got a flesh wound? And so our blood can thicken and things like that. So inflammation is increased. All the while, again, I mentioned earlier that during that time of danger, you're not going to try to protect yourself from cancer or infection. So your immunity genes get turned down. You basically have elevation in inflammation, decrease in immunity. That pretty much sets the stage for almost every single chronic disease in your body. So if every single one of your cells was armed, ready to fight for danger, it's not going to have its own energy reserves for normal functioning to basically perform at its best. So if you have these suboptimal cells, they lead to suboptimal tissues, leading to suboptimal organs, suboptimal systems, and then the whole ecosystem starts to break down. And all of a sudden, if one particular tissue type is affected more, then you get that disease. If you've got some inflammation in your esophagus, all of a sudden it's esophagitis. And now chronic inflammation leads to cancer, things like that. And so basically, long-term or chronic signals in the CTRA leads to increased inflammation, drop in the immune system, but basically causes us to have chronic symptoms depending on where in the body this derangement goes on to chronic disease down the road. Now, why is this so closely tied to that default mode? Remember, the default mode is autopilot survival, and it's all, it's the source of all these automatic negative thoughts that we're constantly thinking of that are repetitive, and it's on to keep us safe unless we're aware that it's on. There's a great study, I think it was performed by Kaiser back in 1998, and you might know about it, called the ACEs study, which is the Adverse Childhood Events Score. And they list basically 10 big T traumas: divorce in the family, drugs in the family, abuse, sexual, physical, neglect, all these traumas. And they noted that the more trauma that you had as a child, later on, you would have a propensity to have increased incidence of mental health disorders and physical health disorders. And so what we do know is that if you've got a lot of these traumas, your default mode is constantly on. The more it's on, it could actually lead to mental and physical health conditions down the road. And so it's our ability to do some of this work. Now, some people don't have these big T traumas, but unknowingly, as a child that has this soul that just wants to express yourself authentically. You're this being that came into this world and just says, "Hey, I just want to be me authentically." But you're saying, "No, you're a little too this. You're never gonna get a job doing this," or "Mommy's not gonna love you if you don't listen to mommy." All of a sudden, you build these filters, and all of a sudden, the default mode starts to get programmed. I need to be something other than myself to actually get safety, love, and connection. And so all of a sudden the default mode is programmed. You're in this ego, and if you don't recognize it, that ego is close. When it's always on, it's tied to that CTRA. So living in that space will eventually cause you to have some kind of chronic symptoms, chronic disease. Which is why, as an interventional radiologist, at the top of my game, I actually had disease.
Yeah, makes perfect sense. And when you understand the connection between the DMN, default mode network, and CTRA, it sheds a lot of light on why 6 in 10 Americans have a chronic disease and 4 in 10 Americans have multiple chronic diseases. It's almost like, how could it not be that way when we're in this chronic state of hyperactivation, and the main effects are inflammation and depressed immunity? Well, that explains a lot of the modern chronic diseases that threaten our survival now, that are number one, that are in the top 10 causes of death: cardiovascular disease, cancer, Alzheimer's, and dementia, climbing the ranks every year. It's a major issue, and it's, there's a tendency to really focus on diet, exercise, which are absolutely important. Neither of us are going to disagree with the importance of those things, but I feel like this is the elephant in the room when it comes to conversations around health and wellness, because we all know people who have done all of the right things when it comes to diet and exercise, but who still have heart attacks, or relatively early in their life, or still develop cancer or develop autoimmunity or something like that. And in that situation, I think it's almost always, at least from my experience, this pattern, whatever we want to call this entire constellation of issues, is very often to blame. But it's in some ways more difficult to shift than just changing your diet, because you really have to shift who you are as a person and how you relate to the world, rather than just what you eat. So talk a little bit about that. Like, how do you approach that, given how deeply wired this is, and how there's this mismatch between our genes and our biology, and and now the environment that we live in is so different than the environment that those genes and biology evolved in?
Yeah, such a good question, and so individualized for people as well. When I wrote the first edition of my book, I talk about the 7 pillars of things that we can actually control in our life that changes the epigenome and the messages that we're giving to our DNA. Their sleep, nutrition, movement, our mindset or our thoughts, our emotions, our community, and then that sense of purpose. And here's this playbook. And I was always wondering why, when given the playbook, why aren't people losing weight? Or why aren't people, not getting into their symptoms? Why is every single year we might come up with so many things to do in terms of our resolutions, but 6 weeks in, we drop out? And it wasn't until I really started to understand this default mode. Some people call it the ego, some people call it the subconscious, but it's developed basically up aspect of our personality that has all these subconscious beliefs that doesn't allow us to take action towards the things that we actually want to do or achieve. Which is why certain people that are actually able to make the sleep and food habits, they're going to notice a shift in their bodies. They're going to notice a shift, a shift in their identity. That's going to be great. You're going to build energetic momentum, be able to jumpstart change in your life. But it's not until you start to notice basically the narrative, the identity, the personality that you are in that cause that disease. And if you're not noticing it, it's difficult to make new choices because your body is almost sort of programmed and habitualized to ways of thinking, feeling, and behaving that it's hard to make change. But I think once people start to understand that there's this part of our biology and nervous system that's not us, that if we could start to recognize that and start to make some new changes, that's when the transformation happens. And so what does it look like for people? It may look like, so all these things are energetically connected. If you shift new choices in how you approach any of these 7 areas of life, you'll notice a shift in your body. And so it might just involve moving radically different. You'll notice the shift in your body. But there are things that we do that can actually quiet down the default mode. One being holotropic breath work. We noticed, people in fMRI machines actually see that as your blood pH increases, it also causes vasoconstrictions to certain regions of the brain. What is one of those reasons? The default mode network. And that's the state that, people get when they're like in alpha states or big time meditators are in that state. So breath work is something that's great in doing so. Rediscovering the things that truly bring you that sense of joy. I think one of these things that I'm starting to talk about is a bucket list. Writing down all the things that you want to do, the travel that you want to do, the people you want to serve, the health that you want to have, writing all those things down. And yes, some of those things you write down is going to come from the ego space, but some of those things you write down is from your soul space. And why I think it's such a great way to be able to do some of these things is you'll notice as you cross things off, like say, hit a $10,000 a month, at work mark. You cross that off and you're like, you know what? I'm proud of myself for doing that, but did it really fuel something? Man, when I was just out dancing with that new group of people last week and we just got moving and laughed for no reason, that really lit me up. So going through a bucket list is so important. One, you're taking action, but what you're doing in that action is you're rediscovering who you are. You're crossing off the things that might have been programmed because it's not going to give you that high as there's things that make you feel really alive. And what I've come to notice is the thing that makes you feel alive, that feeling of aliveness is also the energy that changes the biochemistry and molecular biology that your cells are bathing in, that actually activates the genes for human performance and longevity.
I love that. Yeah, it's feeling good is good for you. Is a shorthand way of talking about it, which I often say to my patients. And it's not just for hedonistic reasons. We have so much research now that shows that the release of endorphins, for example, most white blood cells in our body, which of course very important in our immune function, have receptor sites for endorphins. And so that can explain why things like exercise or dance or sex can actually fine tune our immune system and help increase our immune defenses, reduce the risk of cancer and other chronic diseases, et cetera. And I think, one way of talking about this, which you have been throughout the show and you do in your work, is that this is kind of our birthright as human beings,
Yeah.
is to experience pleasure and joy.
Yeah.
And in so many ways, the modern society doesn't respect that, or doesn't encourage that, or isn't set up to really allow humans to flourish, and to encourage
Most of
that
that
kind
is
of
free to do. It's
right.
it's hard to sell you something and get you fearful of the thing that you don't have, and to sell you something if it's naturally within you already.
That's right. And I would say there's been a confusion as well of distraction with pleasure or joy, because some people might hear this conversation and say, what are you talking about? Our whole culture is designed around pursuit of hedonism. And, like, how can you sit there and say that our culture is not set up for people experiencing pleasure and joy? I actually disagree with that. I think our culture is set up around pursuing distraction and temporary, maybe temporary hits of dopamine, and like very short-lived kind of feelings of numbness, maybe is another word, rather than a deep and true experience of joy or pleasure in our bodies, that comes from being fully present and aware of our sensations, and embodied fully. That's
Yeah.
really not how our culture is set up. And as you said, that's so critical to our health and well-being and our spiritual growth and development as well.
Yeah. I mean, I really wish through my work that people truly understand. I had a daughter. She's 3 years old now. When she was first born, uh, I wasn't able to attend any of the prenatal visits or saw what was going on. And before we knew it, we were like 40 weeks in. The OB asked us to come in to do an induction. Long story short, we find out that she was born with her cord wrapped around her neck and ankle, and there were periods of time she was completely apneic. And I was in the ICU just really understanding sort of the gift and just how precious it is. And the
Mm,
fact that we're here in this world is that we are already enough, that we were loved enough to be given this life. It's one of these cosmic type of, I don't know, jokes that we have, that we are loved, safe, and connected. Unless, of course, there's actually, a saber-tooth tiger standing right behind you. But outside of
right.
that, we are safe,
Yeah.
loved, and connected. And if we could remember that, we would basically shut off that default mode. And it's a cosmic game that we play, but I think that's a beautiful part of the human journey, is to remember ourselves and our power to heal.
Yeah. I love that. And I think it's really important place for us all to remember to put our focus, as the in this world there are so many forces that are pulling our attention away from that. And
Yeah.
this is one recent trend that I can really get behind is gratitude practice. I think
Yeah.
more and more people are understanding the value of it. There's a lot of good research, as you know,
Hmm.
documenting the effects of gratitude. And one thing that does is just really redirect our attention to, in part what you just were speaking of, that we are
Yeah.
loved, we are safe, we are, many of us at least. Obviously, that's not true for everybody, but there's an enormous amount to be grateful for. And that when we turn our attention toward our own internal experience and allow ourselves, like in each moment, there's often this choice, right, where like
Hmm.
I could go down this road, which is like I can pick up the phone and start mindlessly scrolling because I'm feeling a little bit uncomfortable or anxious, or I'm feeling some stress or something is going on that's unpleasant. Or I can like just take a breath and really just allow those feelings to be there and see what emerges from that. And we all have thousands probably of those moments on a day-to-day basis. And it's becoming so much easier to make that first choice, whether it's a phone or a tablet or a computer or a TV or whatever it is. And there's a whole, again, as we talked about, industry that's trying to inviting us to make that choice over and over and over again, and investing in us making that choice over and over again. So to make that choice to be still and be present and come back to our own experience and be in our body is, I see it as a kind of almost a revolutionary act in the culture that we live in today,
Oh yeah, it's revolutionary, but it's the key to our wake up. You
and
know,
evolutionary, right?
yeah, absolutely, absolutely. There's a quote I keep going back to from Viktor Frankl, and certainly if people don't know him, Holocaust survivor, was in Auschwitz, saw his father being starved
And
to death,
search for meaning.
mother and sister murdered, friends and family members tortured, and he still had this to say that you reminded me of, that between stimulus and response, there's a space. And in that space is our power to choose our response. And in our response lies our growth and freedom. Every moment we get to choose. And yes, we are trained and patterned in such a way to react. But in my online courses, I teach a framework called IMPACT, IMPACT. The I am is something you get to decide or choose within yourself. Maybe do it after breath work or nature, but are you love? Are you joy? Are you generous? Are you confident? Are you giving? All these states of being you get to choose. And it doesn't matter what's around you, what's happening, you get to choose these states. So in every single moment, you get to pause, take 10 deep breaths in through your nose, do some 4-7-8 breathing, go for a walk in nature. You can pause when you find yourself being triggered to something. You have the awareness. Oh, what's happening right now? That story of not being enough just came up because she said this to me. Oh, okay, cool. All right. Yeah, that's that old story. Default mode. Usually it's that default mode that's triggering us. C, you choose. What do you choose from? You choose back from your I am. Who do you choose to be? Loving, joyous, connected, generous. Okay, cool. You're that. And then T, you
Yeah.
take action. And every single moment in life, the more you can have these impact moments, whether you walk through a door or you're about to have a conversation, you get very intentional of who you want to be as you make those things. That is the process of transformation done repeatedly over and over again, of being able to make these new choices of who you want to be, believing in that vibrational state of your true being rather than this old way of being. That drives the transformation.
I love that. Yeah, one of my favorite Frankl quotes is very similar. He said, "When we're no longer able to change a situation, we're challenged to change ourselves."
Yeah.
And, as you said, that's a person who can speak about that with authority, given what he went through, compared to what most of us have been through, that he could come out of that experience and still maintain that awareness and that mentality is pretty incredible testament to the power of that perspective in allowing us to be present to our lives no matter what's happening, no matter what the circumstances of our lives are. So, Dr. V, I've really enjoyed this conversation. Tell us a little bit more about your book, Thrive State. I know it's in, is it second edition now that was just
Yeah.
recently released? And then where people can learn more about your work.
Yeah, well, Thrive State is really the state of being that we get to be once we make the choices in these areas of life. And that state is also the state that creates our genes to be turned on to give us optimal health, longevity, and peak performance. And I talk a little bit about why we don't get there, part of our biology, and how to actually break through that. I have courses that to teach people how to do that too. But you can get that book at Amazon or wherever bookstores are sold. You could find out more from my online work and courses at mythrivestate.com. And I'm all over social media at Dr. V spelled out, DoctorVMD on Instagram, YouTube, and all of social media.
Great. Thanks again, Dr. V. Really appreciate you coming on the show, and let's stay in touch. Look forward to seeing what comes next.
Yeah. Let me know how I can support you in any way, Chris. Thanks for
All
having me.
right. Take care. Thanks, everyone, for listening. Keep sending your questions to chriskresser.com/podcast question, and we'll see you next time. That's the end of this episode of Revolution Health Radio. If you appreciate the show and want to help me create a healthier and happier world, please head over to iTunes and leave us a review. They really do make a difference. If you'd like to ask a question for me to answer on a future episode, you can do that at chriskresser.com/podcast question. You can also leave a suggestion for someone you'd like me to interview there. If you're on social media, you can follow me at twitter.com/chriskresser or facebook.com/chriskresserlac. I post a lot of articles and research that I do throughout the week there that never makes it to the blog or podcast, so it's a great way to stay abreast of the latest developments. Thanks so much for listening. Talk to you next time.